Li Jilan, climbing a mountain to gaze far after Master Yan, who never arrives. I climb the mountain and try to gaze afar. Mountains high, lakes also wide. I long for you day and night. I wait for you year after year. Densely the mountain trees flourish. Thickly the wildflowers bloom. Of my boundless affection since parting, I will tell when we meet again. So, this is a poem by Li Jilan, also called Li Jie, and she is one of the very few Tang women poets whose works have been preserved. I think we have already dealt with some woman poets. Just making a brief brush up. Remember that poetry writing during the Tang Dynasty was mostly a man's thing, even more restricted. It was a scholar official sorts of thing. Like a lot of people could get the education and the skills that were required to compose poetry, but for one special group, the scholar official class, writing poetry was not just like an elegant pastime or a cultural refinement. It was the access, it was the gateway to officialhood. If you wanted to become an official in Tang China, you had several avenues, but the most prestigious one, and the one that practically became, if not mandatory, at least highly desirable during the middle and late Tang years, was passing the examinations, the official civil service examinations, particularly the Jinshi, which was the most prestigious of the exams. And the Jinshi's toughest task was actually a literary composition. You had to compose, I think it was a fu and a shi on a given topic. So, poetry became associated with the scholar official class, and most of the poems that have been preserved and selected in anthologies and being given prestige and value were the results, were the effect, were the work of this scholar official class, and they reflect their values and points of view. This does not mean, as we said, that poetry was restricted to these. There were many, many groups that also wrote poetry, even though less of their works has been preserved. Monks. We've already talked a lot about Buddhist monks, also Taoist monks or priests in composing poetry. So they were slightly frowned upon by the conventional Confucian establishment, but they wrote poetry, and some of it is highly appreciated. Women as well. So women had less access to education to begin with, and even if they had access to education, they had no possibilities of becoming a scholar official. So one group of women that did engage relatively much in writing poetry were the courtesans. So in the pleasure quarters of the city, especially the northern hamlet that was quite close to the university, there was this posh neighborhood with a hetairai, and young scholar officials or candidates who wanted to pass the examinations used to go there for entertainment. Now, like the Greek hetairai, these courtesans in this area were not just meant to be, as sources of immediate physical relief and pleasure. They were educated, they were very, very, very refined in the arts and in the games. And part of the job included for all of them being able to compose poetry to answer poetic love exchanges with the scholar officials. So a lot of the poetry that has been preserved by women from the Tang is of this sort of type. It's of women, from women that were courtesans or quasi-courtesans. Generally, the range of subject matter and form that their poetry contains is rather more limited than the male poetry. That is, it's generally focused on the sort of love and parting poems of which Li Jilan's, the one which we've read, is an exemplification. And generally, they're not so strictly adhering to the rigid constraints, especially of regulated verse and with parallelism and so on. They generally tend to prefer pentasyllabic meters and old style types of poems that have less stringent metrical requirements. So, okay, having refreshed this background of Tang women's poetry, what can we say about Li Jilan? Well, Li Jilan lived in the middle years of the 8th century, and she was basically a Taoist poet priestess active in Huzhou, modern Zhejiang, in the surrounding Lower Jiangsu region during the reigns of Emperors Suzong and Daizong, so just immediately after the Alushan rebellion. So she was a contemporary of the Dali era poets, and some later critics have considered her to be as good as any of those 10 talents. So, Taoist priestess, we have another important Tang poetess who was also a Taoist priestess, and I think we haven't read poems by her yet, Yu Xuanxi. And like her other Taoist poet priestess partner, Li Jilan met an unfortunate fate and an early death. Basically, well, she in the reign of Dezong, 779-805, she was summoned to the capital, and she stayed in the palace convent of Yuchen. But then, shortly after, in 783, a rebel general called Zhu Zu managed to occupy the capital and force the emperor to flee. Li Jilan was caught by the rebels and forced to compose some poetry praising the would-be usurper, the would-be emperor. And so when about a year later, in 784, the rebellion was crushed and the emperor returned, he had Li Jilan condemned for that poem that she had written, and she was beaten to death. So, pretty gruesome and early death of hers. 19 poems of Li Jilan have survived, and in her day, she was relatively well recognized, and she had friendships with some important southern literati like Li Shu or Lu Yu, with whom she exchanged poems. The poem we read today, Climbing a Mountain to Gaze Far After Master Jan, Who Never Arrives, is a poem written for her lover, Yang Shihe Zhu Boyun, who was another southern literatus. And probably these poems of her represent, in the opinion of the critics, her best work and are full of passion. The poem we've read was a five syllables per line, old-style verse. And, it's pretty straightforward. There's another poem by her included in her biography in the Biographical Dictionary of Tang Dynasty Literati, which might be next day's poem. And the other one has it's more pedantic, more traditionally representative of what I expect of Tang Dynasty poetry, with parallelism and obscure literary references. This one is more straightforward. It's a poem of desire. It has a woman climbing, as you saw from the first reading, climbing up into a mountain and sighing and longing, looking at the landscape, longing for her departed lover. Remember, climbing mountains in classical Chinese poetry always conveys this notion of insight, of the extended sight that an elevated ground creates, is equated or juxtaposed to the insight, to the inner knowledge that such an experience tends to generate in the viewer, which here is the experience of longing and sadness and looking away into the distance to see any traces of her returning lover, and also a poignant note on the passage of time, the passage of the seasons. One unusual thing about Li Jilan's poem is, because she is a woman writing and expressing her desire, this poem is a bit of the converse of the typical love poems that begin in the 6 dynasties, where it's the male who is composing the poem and expressing the longing, and the female becomes, just an eroticized object of desire, generally in these palace-style poems in which she's surrounded by luxurious materials, and she's in fact equated with them in a way. So she is glamorously helpless, emotionally dependent, and a trophy, literally a trophy, a trophy woman in and of herself. So Li Jilan's love poem transformed the desired object, that is the woman, into a desiring subject. She is the one that is pining for the man. This is not extremely unusual in Chinese poetry. I mean, you had some examples in the Book of Odes, even if Confucian prudishness reinterpreted or reread those poems, basically through the commentaries, through the Mao commentary that put on a glossier and more orthodoxly puritanical interpretation on the said poems of female desire. Anyway, the directness of Li Jilan's desire in this poem has led later critics, especially in the Song Dynasty, to equate her to a woman of low reputation or a courtesan, even though that was not strictly true. Anyway, let's take a look at the poem again, couplet by couplet. As I said, this poem is not very densely hidden away under a curtain of symbolism and metaphor, so it's pretty straightforward. So first couplet: I climb the mountain and try to gaze afar. Mountains high, lakes also wide. So the first couplet, includes generally the background. So the background is the poetic persona climbs a mountain, looks far, and what she sees are far away, wide extending spaces. High mountains, vertical, wide lakes, horizontal. So the images of nature that she sees while looking put the focus on distance, which makes sense because her thoughts are on the distance that is separating her from her lover. Second couplet, which should be the first parallelistic couplet, directly introduces us the feelings of the poetic persona. I long for you day and night. I wait for you year after year. So day, night, year, longing, waiting. So pretty straightforward. The woman is saying, I want you with me. I long for being with you. Third couplet, densely the mountain trees flourish. Thickly the wild flowers bloom. So the second couplet, I would say, I'm not sure. So it depicts nature. It moves us again like the first couplet to nature. We have mountain trees flourishing densely, so thick leaves, maybe thick flowers. Also thickly wildflowers bloom. You have nature in her splendor, nature achieving her flourishing. I imagine this is being used in a contrastive sense. Like nature is flourishing and is achieving its natural aims, while me and you are not together and we are not achieving our natural aim, which would be enjoy, love, be together, flourish, bloom like the wildflowers, flourish like the mountain trees. Yeah? This is at least quite typical in a lot of classical Chinese poetry, the contrast between nature, especially in spring, in the season of love and of flowers and birds getting together and so on, contrasted with the misery of the poetic persona who is out of sync with the cycles of nature. And I think there's an element here. While looking afar, we saw the big distances, and by also seeing those sides of nature that connote spring, flourishing, love, the lack of those elements because of the absence of the loved one is foregrounded all the more. And the last couplet, as usual, rounds up the feeling, which has been expressed all through the poem, of my boundless affection since parting. I will tell when we meet again. So once we meet again, I will transmit you more directly than even in this poem all the feelings that I've had, the boundless affection that I experience for you since we've been separated. So that's it. Pretty straightforward and interesting poem. Interesting even more because of it being a poem in a female poetic persona.